What's the best movie that was ever made? Who's the greatest baseball player? Who is the most important writer of the 20th century? Why am I asking you these questions? The best, the greatest, the most important. There are a lot of things that you have to take into consideration when you're answering those questions. The best movie? What did critics say? How did the movie make you feel? The greatest baseball player? Well, what were his statistics? What influence did he have on the game? The most important writer of the 20th century? Does anybody still read her? What influence did she have on culture? The best, the greatest, the most important. In the end, sometimes the answers to those questions is subjective, isn't it? Your own experience, your own likes or dislikes. When the scribe comes up to ask Jesus, what is the most important, the greatest, the best of all the commandments, Jesus knew it was a trap. Because in the time of Jesus, there were over 400 precepts of the law. And these religious leaders were trying to trap Jesus into choosing one over the other. And Jesus would have none of it. So Jesus says that the greatest commandment is to love God above all things, to love God first in every aspect of your life, and then to love your neighbor as you would love yourself, as you'd want to be loved. So Jesus basically says brilliantly, well, this is really about love. God first, caring for others as you would want to be cared for. And then Jesus says that, it's easy to follow a rule that dictates when you're supposed to eat and not eat, what you can eat, what you can't eat, when you pray, what kinds of prayers you're supposed to pray, various rituals you're supposed to perform. There's nothing wrong with that, he said. But the hardest thing is to put God first. The hardest thing is to love God above everything else. And sometimes it can seem even impossible to love other people as we would want to be loved. But Jesus says that when you live this way, when that is the greatest, the best, the most important commandment that you follow, then all the other precepts of the law, all the other commandments, they fall into place. And Jesus says that when you love God above all things and your neighbor as yourself, then that love will take you to places that you never believed possible. He was born in 1835 in Italy. He was the second of 10 children. He was born to a family that was very poor. Despite their poverty, his parents insisted that he get an education, so he walked miles each day to school. He also was in a very religious family. They taught him that the greatest commandment was love. And that love took him on a journey that he could never have imagined. His name was Giuseppe Sarto. As a young man, he developed a great faith and a love of God, and that led him to pursue a vocation and be ordained a priest. Father Sarto worked very hard as a parish priest, did a lot of education work, a lot of spiritual counseling, but he also cared for the sick. In the 1870s in Italy, there was a cholera plague that swept the country, and he took care of people who suffered from that plague. He struggled both as a priest and later as a bishop to make sure that children got religious formation and education. And he was especially concerned about children in rural, remote areas being educated in faith, as well as young people in urban areas who had more distractions and that prevented them from really pursuing their own religious education. He was eventually named the Patriarch of Venice, and then he is named a cardinal. And he was a very effective Patriarch of Venice. So now fast forward to 1903. The Pope at the time, Leo XIII, dies. He had been the Pope for many, many years. And so the cardinals gather in what is known as the conclave, the meeting in which they elect a new pope, and there was a lot of disagreement. There were a lot of challenges. The pope had been around for a long time, and now they had to figure out who the next pope should be in a new century. And so there were disagreements. Eventually, Cardinal Sarto is elected, and he said no. He refused. He did not feel he was worthy to become the pope. The cardinals prevailed upon him, begged him to accept. He went into the chapel to pray, and when he emerged, he came out and he said that I accept the office of pope and that I will take the name Pius X. As pope, Pius X implemented many reforms in the church. Some had to do with liturgy, others had to do with canon law. He was a man who was very concerned about the times in which he lived and was guiding the church. So many of the events and the conflicts that were leading to the First World War were taking place at this time. So he was a great moral leader, and his voice spoke out about injustices. The other thing was that as Pope, he gave homilies at Mass. And you're sitting there thinking, yes, so what? Well, at the time that he lived, giving a homily at Mass was not a common occurrence, maybe on big feasts or special occasions. But Pius X saw it as important that in the liturgy to reflect on how God's love is present to them in that moment and what they're carrying with them as they leave to return to their lives. He chose as his motto as Pope a passage from Paul's letter to the Ephesians, to restore all things in Christ. As he became Pope, this new century was dawning, and he believed that was his role to help restore the world to Christ. In the last year of his life, Pius X was not well physically, and it is also said that in that last year, the many events that now were bringing about the beginning of the First World War were taking place, and this caused him deep, deep melancholy. He died on August the 20th, 1914, on the very day that Germany, the German troops, entered to overtake Brussels. He later became canonized as a saint and is remembered for the many things he did to strengthen the church. Many of the reforms that he implemented lasted for a number of years, several generations. And you know, one of the first things that I think about in what he's remembered for, one of the primary things, is his great love of the Eucharist and his belief that people should frequently come to receive communion. Now, this may be a second moment where you're like, wait, what? Well, in the time of Pius X, at that period of time, people did not receive communion on a regular basis. And here the Pope is saying, you should receive it daily because you need the presence of Christ and his love to bring into the world and the life that you are trying to live. The other thing that he did was he moved the age of First Communion from the age of 14 to the age of reason. And he did this because he believed that young children in the ages 7 or 8 years old, that they really needed the presence of Jesus in the Eucharist to help strengthen them. Maybe he thought about his own growing up as a child and especially the poverty that he faced, the challenges he faced. He believed that young people needed early in their life to experience the love of Christ and to carry his love with them in the Eucharist. Pius X believed that the Eucharist could take us places that we could never imagine. Do you remember your first communion? I really don't remember much of my first communion at all. I do have this picture, which I often show to people when I celebrate first communions, but actually I don't remember much of it. I'm thinking, however, of young people who in this past spring were supposed to receive communion, and because of the pandemic, it got delayed until the summer. And I have a feeling that they're going to remember their first communion a little bit more and longer than I will. because there was one group that received it on July the 4th, so they'll always remember Independence Day as their First Communion Day. I think maybe it would be thanks to pictures and videos that they have, but young people, in addition to the beautiful dresses they wore and the nice smart suits they wore as well, they all had masks. So those masks are also probably part of their First Communion memorabilia. But I keep thinking about First Communion. Is it the best? Is it the greatest? Is it the most important day of receiving communion? Well, it's important in its own way, absolutely. But my life as a priest tells me it isn't the greatest, the best, or the most important day of receiving the Eucharist. My experience is that it happens throughout our life, at various moments in which we need the presence of Jesus in the Eucharist, his love, to carry us, to strengthen us, to make us more grateful. It's the moment when you have to make an important decision about your life. It's the moment when your heart is broken by sorrow. It's the moment when you get into the college that you were hoping to get into. It's the moment when you don't get into that college. It's the moment when the baby's born, the couple gets engaged, you get a job, you lose your job. The moment when the doctor says you have nothing to worry about. The moment when the doctor says, I have bad news. The Eucharist is needed, not only in those moments, important in those moments, but also in the ordinary moments of going to work, going to school, going about the regular chores of the day. Sometimes the most boring days of life are the days in which we need the presence of Jesus to carry us and to remind us that his love can always guide us and help us find the way. I know that some of you do not feel comfortable yet coming back to Mass and receiving communion. I understand that completely. But let's continue to be spiritually close to each other, especially today as we celebrate the feast of Pius X. May, as we are spiritually close to one another, may we continue to pray for all of those who received communion for the first time and are still waiting to receive their first communion, but also to pray for others who stay away from the Eucharist for other reasons other than the pandemic, that they'll know that this is a place, a moment of great love, compassion, and care for them. May we all pray for that day when we are again reunited around the table of the Lord to celebrate the great commandment of love and to live it each day.